There was a father who was walking with his son, and they walked past a graveyard where they saw a mound of dirt next to a freshly dug grave. And the son tugged on his father's coat and said, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, one got out." We have this fascination in our culture with stories that somehow showcase the reality that death doesn't have to be the end of the story. So much so that Lazarus's story is famous not just in church but outside of church. A story about resurrection is often referred to as a Lazarus story. It's become a catch-all phrase for any story that talks about death after life. And so when you watch Harry Potter and you see him come back from the Deathly Hallows, you see the analogy and the allusions to Lazarus. When Neo in the Matrix comes back to life, you see the allusions to Lazarus in the movie. Over and over again, our culture is fascinated and captivated with the reality that resurrection is possible if the circumstances are right, if the situation presents itself. Because we recognize that the fundamental piece that makes us human is not our ability to empathize, is not our ability to be creative, is not our ability to problem solve or to dream, because other animals do all of these things. The fundamental thing that makes us human, the thing that separates us from every other creature that God has made, is that you and I are consciously aware of the fact that someday we are going to die. We know that our end is inevitable, and we don't like it. We sit with the reality every day because, as the writer of Ecclesiastes put it, God has set eternity in the hearts of mortals. He has wired us for a sense of being and a sense of living that isn't supposed to end. And so every time a life ends, every time that we attend a funeral or see tragedy happen, we feel disconnected from our bodies and placed into a reality that says that this isn't the way things are supposed to be. Something sad has been made true, and it feels disconcerting, and it feels off-putting. It feels like it doesn't fit. And so when Jesus steps onto the scene and spends 3 years healing the sick and raising the dead, he's rewriting the narrative of history. He's not just making sad things come true, he's making the sad things come untrue. And he's reframing our approach to hope and life and joy and all of the things that can be. And yet, when people who love Jesus dearly send message to him that their brother is sick and is about to die, they know that Jesus has the power to heal even with just a word. He's done that before. They don't ask Jesus specifically to come and do something. They bring simply a message that says, Jesus, our brother, the one that you love, your friend, this person that you've eaten at table with is going to die. Aren't you going to do something about it? And Jesus says, that sounds like something I should probably do something about. And then he sits down and stays put for 2 whole days. For 2 days, Lazarus lingers in the tomb because we're told that by the time he gets there, after 2 days, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. What do you do when resurrection doesn't feel like it's rushing to meet us? What do you do when resurrection feels like it's lingering in a city not impossibly far away, but it's not here yet? What do you do when resurrection interferes with our nicely groomed and manicured timelines for things? There's an ancient Jewish belief, it's explained in writings like the Talmud and some of these rabbinic traditional manuscripts, that when a person dies, the spirit of the deceased lingers on the body for 3 days. And within those 3 days, it was fully possible, they believe, for a dead person to come back to life naturally. That a person was, to quote the Princess Bride, was dead, but not really dead. That it was possible that, maybe they recognized in a sense of humility that they didn't fully understand the whole intricacies of how a person lived, and maybe there was complexities to it. Maybe something crazy happened once upon a time and it got religified and codified and became part of the practice. But for the people living in Palestine in the first century, they believed that for the first 4 days it was fully possible that a person could just step out of the grave, walk out, and go back to living the way they were going to live. This was part of the reason that Jewish practices around funerals evolved in the way that they did, and the way it evolved what they are currently today. But don't miss the math in this. If Jesus had left immediately, Lazarus still would have died. If Jesus had left immediately, nothing would have changed. Lazarus would have been in the tomb for 2 days. And then when Jesus had simply gone out and spoken and called to Lazarus to come, and spoiler alert, Lazarus comes out of the tomb, it would have been marked up as just another ordinary miracle, because those are the kind of things that happened. It wouldn't have been an extraordinary event. But Jesus lingers for 2 days. And so when he arrives in the town of Bethany, 2 miles away, he is able to call forth something special, something powerful, something that only God himself can do. The one who spoke all of creation into existence with a word can speak again and bring dead people, and not just sort of dead people, dead people, out of their tomb. This is the mystery of who Jesus is. And Jesus is revealing that in this moment, he is not just a healer and a miracle worker on the par that there are a million others like him roaming the countrysides of ancient Judea. We have records, we have written accounts through contemporaries of the Gospels that miracle workers and healers were a dime a dozen in ancient Palestine. People who could cure the sick and offer pain reductions through a variety of means were not radicals. And don't miss this, Jesus was not crucified and killed because he promised to offer people a cure from pain. In fact, if he could find a way for the Roman government to market that, they would have been all over it. They would have slapped Jesus' face on bumper stickers and sold him at the market. Jesus was not killed because he was a healer. Jesus was not killed because he was a teacher. Teachers were a dime a dozen as well. Jesus was killed because he had the power of life over death over life. Jesus could speak, and the person who was dead could come out of the tomb. This was not something a healer could do. This was not something a magician or a trickster or a shyster could do. This was something that only the one who created the reality of life and death itself had control over. And so when we find the resurrection lingering far off, we can find this reality remade. We can find that the nature of our very existence is being called into question. Because so often, 3 times in fact through this passage that we read, there's this weird interplay between the here and the now and the not yet. Jesus says, they come to him and say, the person you love is sick. And Jesus responds, this sickness is not unto death, to use the old King James language. I mean, that's literally what the Greek says. This is not sickness unto death. And I love the fact that different translations play with this in different ways, because most of the strict literal translations, like the English Standard that I read from, or the King James, use this kind of language. This sickness will not lead to death. Period. End of story. Others who take a more casual approach to the translation process refer to it and say, this sickness, death is not the final destination for this illness, writes the New Living Translation. Death isn't the end of this story, writes Eugene Peterson in The Message. And they capture something in this, that death so often feels final to us because we are wired to believe and to understand and to live as though death in this life is the only one that we get. And so when we see death, we instinctively put period, exclamation mark, underline. But Jesus knows that there is a new story being written. In fact, it is not just a story being written by what he's teaching, but by who he is. Jesus takes our periods and turns them into commas. He takes our exclamation marks and turns them into semicolons. When we write death, Jesus writes life. And where we write destination, Jesus writes pit stop. This is not a sickness unto death. He will die, but yet he will live again. This is the reality that Jesus has come to introduce. Death is not going anywhere. We still live in this world of pain and suffering and sorrow and grief. And yet as Christians, as people who believe that the tomb was empty, that verifiable fact is true, there is another way of living. That we can live between these two realities. That time and space coalesce in Jesus in a way that doesn't make sense. Again, we see the same thing happen when Martha comes up and makes her grand confession to Jesus. Jesus says, Martha, don't you know that your brother will live again? And Martha says, yes, I know. I'm a good Orthodox Jew. I know that the resurrection at the end of time will happen, that there is a place where all of the dead can come together and everything will be okay. And Jesus says, Martha, that's me. I am the resurrection and the life. Everyone, yet though he died, will live again. Jesus is not identifying himself with an event, but with a very breaking, a hinging of history. And this is the reality that Jesus is stepping into, is a blending of the now and the not yet. That we as people who live on this side of Easter are called to embrace a sense of now and not yet in everything that we do. To be an Easter people is to recognize that the timeline that we live in is messy and convoluted, and that Jesus is bursting into life in moments and in places where we might not find it convenient, and that is where God shows up. That is where God acts and moves and flows and does what God does best. If we want to be an Easter people, we can't think about Easter as an event. This is so often the nature that we're given as people who live in 21st century Canada. That Easter is a calendar day that is meant to be sold chocolates and cards and bunny rabbits and pastel colors. And Jesus bursts into it after Good Friday and says, this is not an event, this is a person. I am the resurrection. The resurrection is not something to be marked on the calendar as though it's a day that we can look for and look forward to and long for and plan for. It is a person who steps into reality and says, here I am, live through to me. When resurrection feels far off and when resurrection feels messy, our guiding star, our source of solid ground, our hope in the middle of hopelessness is that we have a person who has shown us what resurrection life looks like, who has shown us what perfect, pure, selfless love has looked like, and has shown us that life does not lead to death and that stays dead. When Jesus steps into our life as a church, as a community, as people, as a family of faith, death does not write the end of our story. The worst thing is never the last thing. to use Frederick Buechner's language. The worst thing is never the last thing. And so we find hope to keep going. To take from this day the seeds of faithful discipleship and disciple making day after day after day, even when it feels like it does not belong or fit. The reality of this day is that this day is our fuel. It is our get up and go for the rest of the year. Because this day proves, once and for all, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that if Easter happened, that a person came out of the tomb and lives for us still today. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. For as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.